yesterday at 10 o'clock, did you have another cup of coffee, cup of tea? Maybe 11 o'clock, you had a little snack? Maybe another half a piece of coffee cake? When you get to 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock, lunch, don't just put down that you had a turkey sandwich. You put down turkey, comma, what kind of cheese, comma, lettuce, comma, tomato, comma, mustard, what kind of bread. Get very specific. Did you have pickles? Doritos? Coke? Diet Coke? Anytime since you woke up this morning you take more medication? When you get to the mid-afternoon hours, did you succumb to that marketing campaign that every day at 2 o'clock is Snickers time, right? Do you have a cookie, brownie, some chips, maybe a Diet Coke, Mountain Dew? Write down whenever you can remember, did you have an 8-ounce equivalent glass of water in that hour or not? Or maybe 2 in that hour. You get to the late afternoon, did you participate in a happy hour? Some cheese and crackers, glass of wine, margarita? For dinner, again, this only works if you're specific. For dinner, don't just put down casserole. What was in the casserole? Tuna, comma, egg noodles, comma, mushrooms, celery, cheese, crouton. If you had salad, good for you. Don't just put down salad. What kind of lettuce was it? Was it iceberg lettuce with a cherry tomato? Or was it mixed greens with spinach? You also put in some cucumbers, some bell pepper, some alfalfa sprouts. What kind of dressing did you put on that salad? And finally, nobody else is going to see this, so this is, don't worry. If you had a snack last night, put it down, but be specific. It wasn't just cookies. Was it 2 or 12 that you had? What kind of milk did you have with those cookies? Whole milk, 2%, 1% non-fat. Now, I'm only asking you to do this for about a minute. I think we can get many patients in 5 minutes to get a pretty good 24-hour food recall. But it also includes not just food, but liquids and medication, dietary supplements, vitamins, and so forth. Because the goal right now is for you to have listed at least 20, maybe 25 or more, food ingredients in the last 24 hours. If in the last 24 hours you don't have at least 20 ingredients listed, you have not been specific enough, or you have a very restricted diet. Okay? Now the reason why you want to get to at least 20 or 25 items is because I want you to look over that list and actually circle the 3 things on that list that you think had the biggest impact on your energy level. Positive or negative. Those 3 cups of coffee in the 8 o'clock hour, I would suspect they had a lot to do with your trying to maintain energy. Maybe that candy bar, circle that too, because that absolutely gave you a burst of energy for about 45 minutes, right? But then it might actually affect your lethargy and decline in energy later on. Now, the point I'm trying to make here is the fact that we want to look at how to change our behaviors. The quality of the energy in is going to affect how sustained that energy will be. Well, and I also understand that dehydration. Why was it so important that you start to write down how many 8-ounce equivalent glasses of water you've had? Because there's evidence now showing us that many people are confusing mild dehydration with hunger. Now, if that hunger pain hit you, merge a couple of different studies in the peer-reviewed literature to do the following. Understand that the average urge for something sweet lasts 8 to 9 minutes. Can you do something different for 8 or 9 minutes? The evidence also shows we are more able to insert a new healthy behavior into our repertoire than to eliminate an old negative one. So, when you have that hunger pang for a cookie or something sweet, down a small bottle of water. Or, and, have a small piece of fruit. A banana, orange, apple, something like that. This actually really works best if you still can have the candy bar. Don't deprive yourself of the candy bar. But the studies show that when you do this insertion of a healthy behavior while you have this urge, less than half the time you end up having the candy bar. But you only do it because you tell yourself, I can have a candy bar if I want. But you've just changed not only your routine and your habit, you've probably ingested hopefully some good fiber, certainly something with nutritional content and so forth. So, I mean, a lot of things to be thinking about in terms of how we change our energy intake. Kid is at the dining room table asking his parents, how come they don't have mad cauliflower disease? I like this one. A woman's at a restaurant telling the waiter, look, I'm going to order broiled skinless chicken breast, but I want you to bring me lasagna and garlic bread by mistake. Intentions, actions, I don't know. Now, why is this important? Because we want to look now at the evidence for the second brain, or the gut brain, the enteric nervous system, in a sense, and its impact on regulating our energy intake. There's not only kind of affecting caffeine and energy drinks, but also the hormones that are responsible predominantly for leading us to feel hungry and or full. Also, a little surprising data for some people about omega-3 and omega-6s and the inflammatory process. So how do we take the research and actually try and outsmart our gut brain, our second brain? So it's referred to as the second brain because the gastrointestinal enteric nervous system really acts fairly independently of our central nervous system. It's influenced by it for sure, but it can operate relatively independently from our central nervous system. But we have to be careful about being oversimplified here. Because if you look at people, just with the example of patients with diabetes, in advanced stages, people are going to develop gastrointestinal problems. And that's in part due to the developing diabetic neuropathy. Well, but the innervation that goes from different components of our GI system are going to affect the brain differently. So the pathways that go from our stomach to our brain are very different sometimes and respond to different things than our upper intestine, our small intestine versus our lower intestine and so forth. So we have to be very careful, again, about how we interpret some of this data. But talk about managing our energy level. Most of you participated just in the last few hours, right? Caffeine is the #1 most common psychoactive substance on the planet. We know it increases your concentration and short-term memory, your ability to attend to things. So thank you so much for having that 6th cup of coffee so that you can pay attention to what I'm talking about. But we also know that people who have been habituated, if you will, to 200 to 300 milligrams of caffeine per day or more, when you withdraw that caffeine, then they have declines in the same things that they were trying to use it to be helpful, concentration, attention, and so forth. Now, we know that it affects your cardiovascular system, it stimulates your cardiovascular system, but what fewer people realize is the research shows that caffeine intensifies your dopamine receptors. So not only with that cup of coffee have you increased energy, but you've also done a little uptick in terms of the feel-good neurotransmitter. Now, chronic use can lead to mild levels of dehydration, and dehydration is important for 2 reasons. The second one I'll share with you in a minute. First one, because if you're confusing dehydration with hunger, and you consume calories your body doesn't need, that's going to cause problems. Long-term caffeine consumption has been linked to increased risk for fibrocystic breast disease, as well as cardiovascular disease. Now, what's interesting about this is that it's not, again, so clear-cut. That is, if you look at the longitudinal cohort data, the Framingham studies, the Nurses' Health Study, Women's Health Initiative, and you compare those people who are caffeine-free to those who consume, on average, 2 to 3 cups of coffee, the equivalent, per day. Over 30 or 40 years, the caffeine consumption increases your risk of hypertension by about 1.5%. However, if you look at the experimental evidence, in the study is where people were brought in, and for like 3 weeks in a row, 10 o'clock each morning, they're given a capsule. That they're blinded to what's in the capsule. On some days, it's a placebo. On other days, it's 200 milligrams of caffeine, about 2 cups of coffee, at 10 o'clock in the morning, and then they track their blood pressure throughout the day. Well, no surprise that your blood pressure increases for the few hours after the 200 milligrams of caffeine. But what many people find a little startling is that there's an average diastolic blood pressure increase of 3 points that last until 10 o'clock at night. 2 cups of coffee is elevating your blood pressure. Now, you may say, 3 points, what do I care? Well, I mean, population studies have demonstrated lowering your diastolic blood pressure 1 point can lower your risk of stroke in the next 12 years by 4%. Now, those are population studies, and they're almost always done with diastolics in the 90s. So you can't go to one person saying going from 86 to 85 lowers your risk that much. But again, these things add up. It's multifactorial. And the last 25 years has seen an increase in our caffeine consumption in the United States. In addition to that, the increased caffeine consumption is now being paired with chocolate syrup and whipped cream, right? It's the double mocha latte phenomenon. So those sweeteners and that fat is going to affect fat storage and affect fatigue in a number of different ways. Energy drinks, that's okay. We have the remedy. We got a 5-hour energy shot, right? We have Monster Drink, Red Bull. Well, this is now, every year for the last 3 years, is a $750 million industry. Now, the real problem here, or one of the significant problems, is that the caffeine in these drinks is not regulated like it is in the soda industry. So you have between 80 and 300 milligrams of caffeine in these energy drinks per 8 ounces. Now, I don't know about you, but if you go through the the supermarket line, you see that 8 ounces of something is pretty hard to find. They're now coming in 16, 20, 24-ounce varieties, okay? These are massive amounts of caffeine, and not all, but some of them have guarana, which actually has more caffeine in it than 3 times as much caffeine as a coffee bean. Now, there's also the sugars, and they have diet variety, but you're looking at a consumption of a lot of substances, especially with some of these energy drinks and 5-hour energy boost or energy shot. You have several thousand percentage of the daily allowance of vitamins B6 and B12, like 3,000%. Okay. Now, I need to be honest here in that there are 3 randomized controlled trials, 5 prospective cohort studies, Framingham, Nurses Health kind of studies, and a Cochrane review. Cochrane review is a couple of really smart folks review hundreds of studies, and they rate the quality of the research. Was it, A, B, or C? And then they're going to make a recommendation. What does the data say? The data is very clear that oral consumption of vitamin B12 is equivalent to a vitamin B12 shot if you're trying to treat a B12 deficiency. So it doesn't require a shot. You can take it orally, and it similarly addresses B12 deficiency. And you take this much B12, and what do you see but a lowering of homocysteine levels, which might have some cardiovascular benefit. But I can't find yet a single randomized controlled trial showing what happens if you don't have a B12 deficiency and you take 3,000% of the recommended allowance. Okay? What's the absorption? What are the interactive effects with other things that people might be taking? What are the long-term potential deleterious effects of this amount of B vitamins and other, again, substances? Now, this is going to be a problem because the prevalence is pretty darn high. You got 1 out of 4 Americans over the age of 13 saying that they've had an energy drink just in the last year. The real danger is now 6% might not sound high, but 6% of people who say they've had an energy drink say the only time they consume an energy drink is with alcohol. The Red Bull and vodka phenomenon. I was in a restaurant and saw for the first time somebody pour a spiced rum and Monster drink. Okay? Now, what does that do? But it actually substantially elevates the risk of problematic and hazardous drinking. Why? Because our body, you can only consume so much alcohol and it's going to go to sleep. But if you're consuming at the same time massive amounts of alcohol with several hundred, maybe even a couple thousand milligrams of caffeine, you're able to ingest that 12th, 13th drink and substantially increase the risk of toxicity. But our body, when we're looking at energy regulation, our body is wonderfully built basically to take care of itself. That is, the hormones that are designed to kind of maintain regular energy levels. Basically, leptin is the satiety hormone, signaling we're full, stop consuming calories, you don't need it anymore. And ghrelin is that associated most with an appetite increase. Now, ghrelin increases most in the first few bites of a meal. So we've anticipated it, oh, we can't wait, this is going to be delicious. We consume the first few bites, and then it starts to go down rather dramatically, depending on what we eat. Interestingly enough, that ghrelin is going to be elevated depending on elevations of estrogen as well as stress. Sympathetic nervous system arousal, stress, is going to elevate your ghrelin level, increase the tendency to want to consume food. And it's this ghrelin that is going to be not only implicated in how much food we take in, but also how this fuel, this energy is utilized. Interestingly enough, ghrelin is most suppressed when we consume carbohydrates. Now, it still goes down when we start consuming fats and proteins, but not nearly as quickly as when we consume carbohydrates. And people who consume higher levels of crude fiber per day have lower ghrelin levels. That's why the promotion of fiber, it's going to help people feel more satisfied because it suppresses that hormone that is most associated with elevations of appetite. Now, all of this is important because if there's dysregulation in the system, in terms of leptin levels, ghrelin levels, and so forth, and it's out of balance, we're going to be consuming more calories than our body needs. Well, when you do that, you gain weight, and if, in fact, it gets to the point of obesity, obesity is seen as pro-inflammatory. Now, with that inflammation, you have cytokines, which are going to actually alter the metabolism of glucose in your brain in such a way your cingulate gyrus is going to get signals to be depressed. So a person who is morbidly obese is not only maybe somewhat saddened or depressed because, wow, I don't feel good about myself, I'm not able to do these things I used to do and so forth, but the obesity that they're experiencing promotes an inflammation that actually then affects brain centers directly of shutting you down, of lowering mood, of having you withdraw, become socially isolated and the like. Now, it's this basically dietary intake and saturated fats and so forth that people are using predominantly to make the argument of why it is in this country we've experienced a surge in the rates of depression over the last 100 years relative to developing countries. It's only in westernized countries that you see this increase in the rates of depression. They're arguing it's because our diet has changed. It's gone from whole foods, from eating game, meat, and vegetables, to one that's much more dependent, or greater proportion of calories are coming from grains, from corn, wheat, and the like, which actually are somewhat pro-inflammatory. Now, when you look at omega fatty acids, omega-3s and 6s, relative to 6s, omega-3s are seen as anti-inflammatory. That is, you're going to find this in garlic and turmeric, linseed oil, cold water fish, and the like. Now, what's interesting is that increasing your intake of omega-3s will change how the carbs you eat are stored. They will be more likely stored as glycogen, ready to be used and burned off for energy utilization. Whereas if your omega-3 levels are low, those carbs are going to be stored more as fat, harder to actually access and burn. Omega-3 fatty acids are also implicated in rates of depression. People who have high levels of 3 tend to score lower on scales and questionnaires of depressive symptoms. Now, also interesting to talk about an intervention. There's a study done where for, I think it was 10 weeks, they said, don't change your diet, don't exercise, don't do anything different. We just want you to take this omega-3 capsule on a daily basis for 10 weeks. Lo and behold, what do they find? With no other intervention, no other changes, but a lowering of emotional distress, primarily a reduction in anxiety, and a lowering of inflammation as measured by cytokine release. Now, omega-6s are actually seen as relatively pro-inflammatory. You're going to find those in corn, sunflower, safflower, sesame oils, and so forth. It's associated, omega-6s are, with increased feelings of isolation, withdrawal. When you intentionally, in these studies, elevate omega-6s far beyond omega-3s, you see people withdraw and shut down and increase their symptoms, reporting of symptoms of depression. Let me clarify, thoughts of suicide. This study only had people who are already suffering from major depressive disorder, moderate level. Everyone in that study met this criteria. They drew blood and found out those that were reporting most frequently thoughts of self-harm and suicide had the highest levels of omega-6. Now, I would refer you to nutritional experts in that literature to see there's controversy of, it comes down to basically the ratio of omega-6s to 3s. It's not like you're going to eliminate one and elevate the other. But there's controversy in terms of whether the best ratio might be 2 to 1, 3 to 1, and so forth. Now, how do we start to take the research literature and use it to our advantage and outsmart our gut brain? Fancy way of saying it, but gastric satiation is volumetric, while intestinal satiation is nutritive. In a nutshell, this is saying it matters more bulk or volume in our stomach that then will send signals to the brain that we're full. It's the distension of the gastric lining that triggers the neural impulses telling the brain, we should stop now, we're probably satisfied. Whereas the signals, the neural networks that go from the gastrointestinal tract down the small intestine, large intestine, and so forth, those signals are much more influenced by the chemical makeup of the foods we eat, the nutritional composition. As one example, CCK or cholecystokinin is just one element that it will more intensely signal to the brain we're full based on the amount of fats and proteins that are in the intestine. That actually gives some credence to the suggestion some people make for kind of lowering the caloric intake per sitting by saying before you eat a large meal, 15 to 20 minutes before, pop a handful of almonds. Something that is somewhat nutritious, good balance of fats and proteins. The 15 or 20 minutes to take will take it to get down to the intestinal tract might then give you a head start and sooner in the process save you a couple hundred calories of this large meal you're sitting down to enjoy. Other issues that will help us increase our sense of fullness and satiety. Data suggests that people who are put on high protein liquid diets tend to report being hungry again in half the time than if we had given them that protein in solid form. In 90 minutes, you ingest several grams of protein, you're going to report, I need something else now. Same amount of protein ingested by a fillet of chicken, could be meat, fish, what have you. It's usually about 3 hours later that people are then reporting that they're hungry. Flaxseed has probably more evidence supporting it as a supplement, as a nutritional component in promoting a sense of fullness than any other kind of supplemental or alternative approach. And why small meals and slower consumption would be a good dietary habit to get into? Because the data suggests that 40% of the calories we consume in a large meal is in our small intestine before we're even done eating. That suggests that if we can actually not consume all these calories in 10 minutes and give our body some time to have its natural signaling mechanisms tell our brain, no, you probably don't want any more, you can slow down. We're allowing our body's natural process and energy regulatory mechanisms to be able to work. Other things that stabilize energy, people who have breakfast each morning. Ideally, it's going to be a good source of protein as well. That's going to actually help lower hunger mid-late morning. Why? Because when cortisol spikes, as it does for most of us, and then declines, the lack of energy can be associated with, hey, I need some more energy, let me take in calories, when that actually may not be necessary. Just like protein intake of fiber at the same time you have any kind of carbohydrates is going to slow the metabolism. Pair those two together would be important. And that's really important because maintaining stable blood sugar is critical for us in terms of energy levels. Now, the study came out of the journal Neurology just a few months ago. And what they had done was that several hundred people were followed for 4 years. And the first day of the study, nobody had a metabolic disorder, no pre-diabetes or diabetic problems. But everyone was in the normal range of blood sugar, fasting blood sugar. Some were high normal, some were low normal. It turns out that over the course of 4 years, they do brain scans, finding out that over time their hippocampus shrunk to some degree, as it does for us as we age. But that 10% of that shrinkage was due to the fact that some people were in the high end of normal of blood sugar versus those who are at the low end. So that blood sugar dysregulation really was a precursor for changes neuroanatomically in our brain that might result in anything from poor short-term memory, poor concentration, and the like. Any foods that are going to elevate tryptophan and melatonin, that could be nuts, cherries, certain dairy products, are going to help regulate the sleep-wake rhythm. And in addition to CoQ10, probably ribose is second in terms of how much evidence there is to support it at least being considered. Do your due diligence. But ribose is a central element in ATP, adenosine triphosphate. And so that actually may be something that will also address a person's fatigue along with CoQ10. And so I mentioned about mild dehydration. Why is that so important? Well, if in fact the dehydration is confused with hunger, we take in calories we don't need necessarily, and that leads to weight gain in an inflammatory process. That's one pathway. But the second reason is because if we're even mildly dehydrated, our blood is thicker, requiring more effort from our cardiovascular system to pump that blood throughout our body, therefore requiring more energy that wouldn't necessarily be required otherwise. A couple of other studies to keep in mind, a crossover study where what they did for 1 month, they randomly counterbalanced the order it happened. But if you were in the study, over the course of 3 months, there was 1 month where you had a greater proportion of your calories come from carbohydrates, a second month where a greater proportion was coming from fats, and a third month that a greater proportion was coming from protein. Turns out that it was the protein-rich diet that led to fewer reports of fatigue, greater reports of energy, greater sense of fullness and satiety, less reports of being hungry. Why? Because in part those proteins are going to trigger the glucose synthesis that's going to be able to kind of not only signal the brain that we're full, but also essential in terms of